Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Georgia Hablutzel, and I teach here at the AA as part of Diploma Unit 7, along with my colleagues and co-organizers of this lecture series, Platon Issaias and Khosravi. And it's with such great pleasure that I invite Alain Pottage as our speaker for the second installment of the This Land is Your Land lecture series. Alain is currently a professor of law at Sciences Po and previously the London School of Economics. He has held positions at the Cornell Law School, University of Paris, the Goethe University, Griffith Law School, Harvard, and the University of Sydney. In this lecture titled Land as Medium, Alain mobilizes the technologies of control and information which have been transforming property and territory, generating a new understanding of medium. It is exactly with the capacity of moving beyond how law, legal theory, and history is usually discussed, which I'm sure we'll witness here today, where Alain describes how legal concepts, if read in a certain way, could have a specific reality and materiality. Perhaps through the understanding of law, its construction, we as visual and spatial practitioners can begin to understand how law is generative, has consequence, is normative and transcendent. If we have access to these new lenses of understanding through the expansion where we borrow from other disciplines, what are the new questions which we can ask? What is the impact of this, and how can we interact with law and its production of artifacts within thinking, investigating, and producing a renewed series of spatial paradigms? So it's with such great pleasure that I give the lecture hall over to Alain.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Georgia, for inviting me to this wonderful series and for that very generous introduction. So the rubric for this series of lectures, or the brief that I was given, invited reflection on, quote, the legacies of power embedded in the recognition of land and the making of territory. And I think that question is extremely timely, this question of power and territory, because in the Anthropocene, or whatever we are going to call this geosocial moment in interregnum before the working group reconvenes and re-energizes, land and territory have been rematerialized, I think much more than reimagined, have been rematerialized as dimensions of the Earth as a planetary entity. And this event forces us or compels us to reimagine property as a relation that connects law to land or territory. And so what I want to do is to maybe explore some ways of bringing our understanding of property, land, and territory into this contemporary moment. I would like to do that by way of contrast between two senses in which one can think of land as a medium. The first, I think, will be quite familiar. It's a sense that emerges from or is consonant with the sense of nomos that people, I think, are very familiar with through the work of Carl Schmitt. I'm not really going to talk about very much today. The second is I want to contrast that sense of nomos, or that sense of the normative configuration of land with an older sense that goes back to the colonial period. And so I want to really engage with that question of legacies of power in thinking about that. I'm actually not very sure about my title. I'm not sure that land as medium is quite right. Maybe the way of thinking about it is to think about land and law in a sense, a reversible relation between one being the medium for the other. But I can come back to that, or we will come back to that. So first of all, some of you will be familiar with this character that you can see here. This is 1928. The German architect Hermann Sörgel was outlining his vision of what he called Atlantropa. So inspired by his reading of various bathymetric and hydrological studies, notably Otto Jessen's book on the Straits of Gibraltar, Sörgel reimagined the Mediterranean as an immense natural power plant. So the level of the sea in the Mediterranean drops by about 4 meters between the southern extremity of Spain and the coasts of Egypt and Libya. And this gradient draws its waters into a zone where the prevailing temperatures cause significant evaporation. So if one were to build a dam of almost a kilometer deep, just over 900 meters deep, 35 kilometers long, then the Mediterranean would be deprived of its replenishing connection to the Atlantic, and sea level would start to drop by hundreds of meters. This would make a huge expanse of land available for fresh occupation and cultivation. By Sörgel's reckoning, this would take more than 100 years. But in the meantime, the Gibraltar Dam would turn the Atlantic into a standing reserve of hydroelectric power. So this would generate something like 120 gigawatts of power, more than 1,000 times the output of the largest existing hydroelectric plant in Germany. The project was originally called Paneuropa, after Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europa of 1923, which was a tremendously successful book in Europe in the 1920s. It went through several translations and several editions. And the point of Pan-Europa was to counter the rise of American power by turning Africa into what Coudenhove-Kalergi called Europe's plantation. The name Atlantropa, which Sörgel adopted in 1930, expressed the ambition of creating a new geostructural supercontinent for white Europeans. The dam, if I just go back to the image, the dam would extend the European rail network into Africa, which, as you can see here, would be terraformed by European occupation by using yet-to-be-invented desalination technologies, first to irrigate the Sahara, and then to turn the Congo Basin into a vast inland sea. So where did the inspiration for this come from? Well, it came from a certain perception of the United States as a territory that formed up in Europe in the late 19th century, when America began to seem like a very particular kind of economic space. In America, you could see a singular relation between economy and territory that was premised on the ready availability of raw materials, a rational and, of course, racialized division of labor, the creation of infrastructures such as the railroad and the telegraph, which intensified supply chains and production at the same time as keeping them contained within a single territory. Confronted with the emergence of an unprecedented continental economic zone independent from the rest of the world, commentators in Europe warned of American danger, the péril américain, for example, and devised strategies for the reciprocal integration of territory and economy. So if European nations wanted to retain or regain their global dominance, they would have to embark on equally radical reorganizations of their national economies and create a new form of territoriality that converged the political with the economic. To the east, Russia was emerging as what Alfred Mackinder called a pivot state, again through the power of the railroads. Mackinder spoke of Russia as a vast economic world, more or less apart and inaccessible to oceanic commerce. Haushofer and Keller imagined or proposed a German-dominated Mitteleuropa, constituting a large diagonal strip through the Old World, a political bridge between the North Sea and the Persian Gulf, a buffer between Russia and Western Europe, and a planetary counterweight against the existing world powers. Now, this re-territorialization of Europe was imagined not just as reintegration, but as colonial expansion. In Pan-Europa, to go back to Coudenhove-Kalergi, he proposed that it was as a joint project of the white race that Africa should be turned into Europe's plantation, and this was to constitute an effective counterpart to America's tremendous economic territory. These imaginings of Eurafrica, were idiomatically akin, of course, to early modern justifications of colonialism. As one French politician put it at the time, alone among the continents, Africa does not have a history. But whereas the land appropriations of the earlier period depended upon the technologies of boats, cannon, and bookkeeping, projects such as Sörgel's were predicated on the transformative power of the railroad, and especially electrification. Crucially, there was the promised bounty of hydropower. As he put it, quote, as one commentator puts it, hydropower became the epitome of the forward-looking, rationally organized energy supply in the interwar years. It was clean and, most importantly, potentially inexhaustible. It also lent itself to visual media, with depictions of giant engineering structures and the attendant continent-spanning networks of power lines capturing the public imagination. In the early decades of the 20th century, an infrastructure that Euro-Americans now take for granted was being assembled extraordinarily quickly. In 1891, and you can see it here, the first long-distance electrical power line was built between Laufen and Frankfurt. This carried 20,000 volts over 176 kilometers, proving that electricity could be transported safely over long distances. So given the technical capacity to transmit high-voltage alternating current across long distances, the settling of a standardized frequency of 50 Hertz across Europe, and techniques for computing the distribution of demand, supply could be generated at some distance from demand. Utility managers could arbitrage between coal and hydropower, depending upon the season. I'm going to skip a bit. So what emerged when you looked at the emergence of power lines such as this was a figuration of territory that was no longer premised on boundaries and jurisdictions, but which corresponded to a topology of electrical lines. And those electrical lines in turn represented a mode of production that was abstracted from the economy of agriculture or industry as they'd been understood. In 1892, John Hopkinson, British electrical engineer, noticed that, quote, a supply of electricity must be delivered at the very moment when the consumer chooses to use it, and as long and as no longer than he pleases to use it. In other words, electrical current must be produced in the same instant that it is consumed. And I think this is an image that we have actually very much in the modern world. You think about the interface of the light switch on the wall. You expect the electricity to spring into action the minute you depress that switch. But what's interesting about this idea of electrical current being produced or being summoned up or being available, ready, in the moment that you call upon it, is that the relation between consumption and production disappears. If you look at what electricity replaced, certainly for domestic lighting, which was gas, then from the perspective of the supplier, gas has substance and quantity. As it emerged from the distillation process, gas was fed into these enormous telescopic gas holders or gasometers, which indicated the current level of reserves to even the most casual observer of the urban landscape. This was not the case with electricity. If production and consumption occurred in the same instant, then the relation actually was not one of production to consumption at all. Nothing was transferred from the supplier to the consumer, not even something with the attenuated materiality of a gas. In the case of gas or water, there was a moment in the process of production when the resource existed in the suspended state of a stock that was maintained and resourced by the supplier, and which had a distinct spatio-temporal existence. But phenomenologically, the existence of electricity is not referable to a stock, and nor even to earthly resources, but to the emergent work of modulation that produces both the resource and its consumption. Utility managers managed the resource by using calculations. Computers, who in those days were, of course, the work of the computer spelt with an O, was gendered. These were women who carried out calculations with slide rules and different kinds of apparatus to calculate exactly when demand would arise and make sure that the capacity existed within the generating station to meet it. It's a huge enterprise. And I'm not going to talk about this now. What emerges from this scene, the scene of the management of electrical utilities, is the discipline of cybernetics, because this is what gives rise to what was called electrical mathematics, doing mathematics through electrical components, which then gave rise to the cybernetics of von Neumann and Norbert Wiener and others. But the point I want to make is that in this case, although production depended on supplies of coal or hydropower, the work of production happened in the middle, in the infrastructures that modulated inputs and outputs. So as one observer puts it, electrical utilities do not exploit, refine, and supply a resource, but rather create it. The appropriation of electricity hinges on the technical production of controllable currents. And as Heidegger noticed, the grid is a technique of control that calls into being the environment from which it extracts being and value. In the famous image, the turning of the hydroelectric turbine interpolates the Rhine into existence as hydraulic stock. The river answers the call or challenge of the electrical grid, which performs the recursive switching through which, in Heidegger's terms, reveals itself to itself. The relevance of this new technology of control or production to the conception of territory was recognized by Carl Schmitt, who was a keen observer of the process of electrification. Thematically, his essay on Großraum participated in the debate about the economic power that was so expansively framed by Atlantropa. But although this was a political juridical figure, responsive to the claims of Hitler's Germany, it was also steeped in the technicalities of current. Schmitt talks about, quote, the rational exploitation of the diversity of energy production plants, rational division of different loads, a return to reserves that assist one another, and an equilibrium between secured and unsecured outputs and peak loads. All very strange for those who are familiar with Schmitt to see this very technical description of the process of electrical production. But in a sense, that turned out to be inspirational for Schmitt, because he perceptively saw how the governance of current, the techniques of modulation and control that produced electricity, environmentalized the world. That is, how governance of this kind abstracted away from cartographic or Tellurian space to project a territory that was correlative to the operational states of the system. And this gave him the sense of space that interests contemporary readers of the nomos of the earth. Directly from his observation of the formation of what in 1912 a professor at the Berlin Institute of Technology and the director of the AEG had called an elektrische Großwirtschaft. So what is going on here? It's obvious that the image of Atlantropa, or Schmitt's nomos, suggests a new program of appropriation, a new way of spatializing, occupying, or possessing the earth. And that's certainly true how Heidegger understood the agency of the turbine, the constitution of the earth as standing reserve. Perhaps in the light of the discourses of the Anthropocene, one should think about the expansion of these infrastructures. And one way of thinking about them, and this is where I want to sort of maybe begin to look backwards a bit from this, is to think of them as a mode of terraformation. And again, remember, we have a dissolution of an older logic of property and territory based upon the geometry of borders and boundaries, and the emergence of a new logic that traverses the earth with pylons, pipelines, and undersea cables. The older understanding of territory, the more familiar one, is premised on the idiom of inscription, as if the earth were just a wax tablet upon which borders and boundaries are inscribed. This idiom is expressed, for example, in the etymologies of Isidore of Seville, that were composed in the 6th century, where Isidore says, quote, territory, territorium, is so called as if it were toritorium, that is, broken by a plough, triturum aratro, and by a team of oxen, taurus, for the ancients used to designate the boundaries of their possessions and territories by cutting a furrow. The same image applies to Locke's theory of property, in which the act of appropriation is strangely virtual, abstracted from the materialities and contingencies of the land that it seizes. The more recent idiom of the Plantationocene proposes a richer, more earthly understanding of the violence of appropriation. Property, of course, is still inscribed in the earth. As Kenneth Olwig put it in the conversation that gave rise to the notion of the Plantationocene, property is, quote, a space which is uniform in its own economic context, but does not really exist in the greater scheme of earthly life. But the grid form of the plantation filters, processes, parasitizes the greater scheme of earthly life. It allows some processes and entities to flourish. It negates and leaves others to die away. And it controls, or it seeks to control, the processes of weather or the cycles of minerals in the earth and the atmosphere. And it's that filtering, controlling operation of the grid is the point at which the proprietary becomes earthly. I do have a question about Plantationocene, which I think is something we could talk about later, perhaps. It's just interesting that the grid in question is the division between different plantations. The plantation itself is not necessarily in the form of a grid. What is striking about the plantation is the mode of production, the organization and the discipline of production within the plantation. So when you have inventions, such as, for example, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, a very famous invention from the 19th century, what you're seeing there is a kind of mechanism that reveals the already mechanistic nature of the plantation. And so when you look at early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century American factory design, architects very explicitly model the design of the factory on the plantation, or the image of the plantation. So I'm just wondering whether, I'm sorry for this aside, I'm just wondering about whether we think about process or whether we think about grid. And I'm kind of more inclined to process, I think, in terms of thinking about that. In any case, the theme of terraforming is interesting because of its somewhat paradoxical nature. Terraforming is supposed to be something that humans do to alien planets, to turn them into ecological surrogates for the Earth, or as it happens, Holocene Earth. Why speak of terraforming Terra itself? Why would one need to make the Earth habitable for humans, given that habitability is a mode of existence that has formed up on Earth as a way of being on Earth? There's a passage of Kim Stanley Robinson's Blue Mars. I've tried to read these books, and with apologies, to the author, they're tough going. There's a passage in Robinson's Blue Mars in which one of the characters, Sax Russell, member of the First Hundred and a now enlightened former physicist, offers an insight into the terrain of Mars as it was before terraforming. It was, quote, not chaos, technically speaking, but wild, speaking its unimaginable age in polyglot profusion. The planet spoke in the language of geomorphological and atmospheric processes and susceptibilities. To this wilderness, the terraformers brought soil from Earth, which, by means of a variety of traditional earthly gardening practices, they used to cultivate a diversity of plants, composing the traditions and materials of Earth and Mars. The name that Robinson gives to this mode of horticultural craft on a planetary scale is ecopoiesis. And for Kim Stanley Robinson, this is a a map from Blue Mars. For Kim Stanley Robinson, as for Ursula Le Guin, with her stories of sentient forests, the point is to return this imagination of ecopoiesis to Earth, to inform the necessary re-engagement with our own planet, a re-engagement that has become all the more necessary in this moment of the Anthropos. In Blue Mars, a character who was born on Mars visits Earth, which he discovers to be even vaster and greater than his own planet, and he says, among all the ways that it was greater even at being Martian. This is timely in the era of the Anthropocene, precisely because there's a sense in which the Earth has been terraformed in a malign way. Humans, or a certain element within the human species, have become, in a sense, alien to the Earth, have turned the Earth into an environment or ecology that is fitted for a mode of alien existence. Alien in the sense that it has emerged, grown, fattened, and rooted itself in the planet like an alien excrescence, like an exoparasite that feeds off the vitality of the planet and other humans. What I would like to try and anatomize in the time I have left are the juridical sinews of this alien creature, the legal forms and operations that vivify this alien, or, in another sense than Haraway's, this more than human being. And my suggestion is that these sinews first appear in the context of the appropriation of territory, and more precisely in the moment of colonial appropriation. And the way in which they do so illuminates the relation between land and medium, between law and media. As Katrin Trüstedt reveals in her work on the figure of Stellvertretung, which I'm not going to translate, someone else could do it much better than I could, meaning speaking for or in the place of another, the proper register of media theory is agency. Agency in a sense that is estranged from law and estranges law from itself. So, to clarify the sense of media or medial agency here, perhaps I can return to the scene of the late 19th century America and the railroad, and its formation as a particular kind of economic space. But this time to see the process through the lens of Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media. For McLuhan, the expansion and intensification, so to speak, of the railroad was a manifestation of the role of media as agents of transformation. As he puts it in The Medium is the Message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. The railroad did not introduce movement or transportation or wheel or road into human society, but it accelerated and enlarged the scale of previous human functions, creating totally new kinds of cities and new kinds of work and leisure. The point, as McLuhan often put it, is that media are not agents of transportation, that is to say ways of carrying or communicating information, but rather agents of transformation, and specifically the transformation of humans and their competencies and susceptibilities. That is the sense in which McLuhan characterizes media as extensions of man. Media supervivify the human by generating new human competencies and novel patternings of human association. When one medium eclipses another, it introduces a new mode of existence. So, to quote from Understanding Media, just before an airplane breaks the sound barrier, sound waves become visible on the wings of the plane. The sudden visibility of sound, just as sound ends, is an apt instance of that great pattern of being that reveals new and opposite forms just as the earlier forms reach their peak performance. Each media epoch introduces a new way of being human. So the point of saying that the content of a medium is another medium, which goes back to my title, and the problem with my title, was to contradict the prevailing assumption that media are just tools, that they derive their agency from what we do with them, or that they're just vehicles for the content that we channel through them. On the contrary, media have already generated the ratios and patterns of perception through which we apprehend content in the first place. They have elicited the competencies, modes of attention, states of being that induct the reader or viewer into the immersive state that allows content to appear as such. So, to give up on the distinction between medium and content, to begin instead with the relation of medium to medium, is to shift the focus from content to the operations that generate perception. What does this have to do with property, land, and territory? Well, to begin with, there's a perhaps obvious sense in which appropriation is necessarily a medial operation. The premise of John Locke's theory of property was that the earth was given to Adam and his descendants in common by Genesis 1:28, subject to the injunction to first preserve oneself and then others. Common property is individuated into private property through labor, when, as we know, in a state of nature, a person mixes their labor with the land. But Locke's state of nature is strangely devoid of language and communication. The act of appropriation speaks for itself. The act of laboring seems to bind the other members of the community immediately, by virtue of a natural law that seems to be just part of the fabric of the world and an inbuilt component of mentalities. But even if one were to grant Locke the fiction, the colonial fiction, of the state of nature, things could not have been like that. Appropriation presupposes communication. In medieval English law, ownership was manifested, primed, by what was called the act of, quote, taking esplees. Esplees is spelled E-S-P-L-E-E-S. Taking esplees meaning the act of harvesting cultivated crops. Esplees was a medieval Anglo-Norman derivation of the Latin root that today yields the word explicit. The plants that were harvested were esplees because they made explicit the labor that had gone into making them grow, and through that, the right of the person who occupied the land and cultivated them. And when that person harvested esplees in public, in full visibility of the community, explicitly, were claiming these emblems of ownership as their own, you could presume that the community recognized their ownership of that piece of land. Their ownership was rooted in tacit custom and the collective memory of the locality. So again, ownership presumed observation and communication. Land existed in law in the medium of collective memory. This is rendered in theoretical terms by Michel Serres in The Parasite, where he develops an interpretation of Rousseau's theory of original appropriation. Whereas Locke thinks of appropriation as an effect of mixing labor with land, Rousseau highlights the act of enclosure. One becomes an owner of an tract of land, at least for a while, by enclosing it. Serres observes that the first founder was the person who, having made an opening in a hedge that enclosed an area, says, "This is my right of way." That's actually not the correct translation of the book. I've modified it a bit. Serres just says "mon passage." But anyway, this is my right of way, and found gardeners feeble enough to believe him and to allow him to do this. So notice what Serres does to the act of enclosure. In his interpretation of Rousseau, what is significant is not the enclosure or hedge as such, but the opening made in it to allow the owner to pass through and back. In other words, ownership as a relation to a static tract of land is operative only on the basis of movement, displacement, exchange. The owner has to exist within a community and economy, so that what is privative, what seems to be exclusive to the owner, is in fact parasitic upon, sustained by the life of that community or economy. One can see a contemporary version of this in the valuation of urban real estate in the contemporary world, where the value of properties in exclusive neighborhoods depends upon the vitality and infrastructures of the city from which they secede, so to speak. There are two implications here. First is that appropriation is not the product of an autarkic individual act. As the Irish lawyer and economist Thomas Edward Cliff Leslie observed in the 19th century, quote, "What requires explanation is not the want or desire of certain things on the part of individuals, but the fact that other individuals, with similar wants and desires, should leave them in undisturbed possession, allot them a share of such things. It is the conduct of a community, not the inclination of individuals, that needs explanation." This then leads to a second and more crucial point, which returns us to McLuhan's idea of transformation. For Locke, the agency of the proprietor exists already, latently, in their embodied self. When someone acquires land by mixing their labor with it, they express or realize competencies that they always already possessed, simply by virtue of being God's creature. By contrast, Serre's analysis points towards the idea that the agency of the owner, competencies and capacities that they acquire as owner, are a function of the settlement that is reached between them and their neighbors. In one sense, the point is just that ownership is a social institution. The status of an owner is an office within that institution. Perhaps that's obvious, but with McLuhan in mind, I would suggest this social institution is medial in nature, in the sense that it takes shape within the dimension of custom and collective memory, and the figuration of the person or persona that is developed in this dimension is a human vivified by media. So I'd like to, with the question of the Anthropocene in mind, focus a little on this notion of terraformation and roll it back to the colonial period. Because what I want to suggest is that what the Anthropocene working group following Peter Hack called the technosphere, for what Michel says in another book, The Natural Contract, calls tectonic humanity. This tectonic humanity, this socio-technical excrescence, is of course a European or Euro-American production, the result of centuries-long processes of terraformation by Euro-Americans. Maybe we could just go back to that initial moment. Map of the Carolinas. The America that was encountered by English settlers was not, as John Locke had it, a state of nature. It was a state of culture. Cultures plural. A diversity of peoples, knowledges, plants, and fauna. Some of that diversity was incipient, and some of it was generated as the colonial encounter unfolded. The correspondence that passed through Locke's hands between 1669 and 1673, when he was secretary and treasurer to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, would have shown him the reality of this state of culture. It's an irony which most of you will be familiar with, that Locke, as the inauguration of English Enlightenment, was also an owner of slaves through the Lord Proprietors of Carolina. The settler in the Carolinas found themselves outnumbered and outpowered by a number of indigenous American peoples, notably the Edisto, Kewahah, and Iroquoian Westos. They were dependent not only on the forbearance of these peoples, but on their active generosity in demonstrating hunting and fishing techniques, in providing seed stock, and in supplying food when it was desperately needed. They were also dependent on the skills of yet another people, namely the small number of African slaves who were brought to the colony via Barbados in 1670, and who had the husbandry skills necessary to tend herds of cattle, and who were more familiar with techniques and implements needed to grow crops, such as sugar and tobacco. And what this map depicts is one part of the black rice hypothesis, which many of you will be familiar with, which is the hypothesis that rice was actually introduced into the American colonies by slaves from West Africa. Not only the seeds, but also the cultivation techniques for growing rice in estuary areas, which the white settlers did not possess. And if Carolina, in the space of about 30 or 40 years, became a major supplier of rice, an exporter of rice, it was through the skills of those people. So, when the first ship set out, Locke and his patrons knew very well that the scroll of the newly drafted fundamental constitutions of Carolina would not be unfurled in a state of nature. Given the experiences of the first English settlers in America, they'd already made provision for temporary laws to facilitate adaptation to conditions on the middle ground. So the appropriation, inverted commas, of the Carolinas did not proceed from the immediate imposition of assimilative, uniform government, but from responsiveness to instability, dissolution, and contingency. Locke had the Carolinas in mind when he wrote the chapter of his two treatises on property, almost 2 decades after his service with the Lords Proprietors. But what he conjured up was what Bikram Singh Gill calls a world in reverse, a state of nature that was not only available for appropriation without negotiation or consent, but which actually called for the improvement that the supposedly superior agricultural skills of English settlers would bestow upon it. The 2 treatises rewrote a history of colonial dependencies, or overwrote a history of colonial dependencies, insecurities, and contingencies. So, what that process of colonial appropriation, precisely because it takes place in slow motion, so to speak, is the character of appropriation more generally. The process of appropriation was distributed in space and time, and necessarily involved or passed through a number of human and non-human agents. Distribution in space or time was a function of the fact that colonial appropriation was largely a transoceanic process. This question, which was already evident in the case of the Roman Empire, trade in the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Indian Ocean, was how to manage the contingencies and how to bring these processes into a whole. The form that interests me here is that of what Stephen Harris calls the long-distance corporation. The most familiar long-distance corporations of the early modern period were the Dutch and English East India companies. Perhaps one of the most pervasive and earliest was the Jesuits. These were the vehicles through which colonial ventures first proceeded. It's not states that colonized, it was companies or corporations. The expense of putting together expeditions to cross the Atlantic or around the Cape of Good Hope exceeded the capacities of early modern monarchies. So in England, notably during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and then the 2 Charleses and James, monarchs granted charters to corporations which gave them monopolies on certain trade routes, certain trade, and the lands that they occupied. In terms of its operation, the long-distance corporation was adapted, or adapted itself, to the kinds of contingencies encountered by the settlers of the Carolinas. The corporation held together, gave a kind of speculative unity to the diversity of operations that were involved. And if you think about what the classic problem encountered by these long-distance corporations was, it was what economists characterize as a problem of agency. How to mobilize and assure the knowledge and acumen of, for example, the sea captains, not only had to navigate these oceans, but also use their discretion to change course, repair ships, generate certain expenses to get to where they were going. Agents who dealt with the various rituals and expectations of, for example, Native Americans in relation to transactions for furs. Agents who could judge the quality of local wares. And the idea was to bring these different embodied and localized competencies and capitalize them to the benefit of the corporation. Now, the long-distance corporation was not just a legal form. It might well be that legal form was less vital to the corporation than relations of patronage. And as Hobbes complained in Leviathan, the state itself was a proliferation of corporate entities, formed primarily as agents of political interest. And even today, corporation is not just a legal form. Legal coding composes with economy, politics, and marketing, and so on. But there is a sense in which, even in a context in which legal form was not highly differentiated, the legal idiom of the fictitious person gave long-distance corporations their effectivity. It was the figment of a unitary entity that gave the corporation its tentacular reach, its ability not only to navigate contingency, but to exploit, parasitize, and capitalize it, to turn it to profit. So one should not discount the ontic effects of the fiction of corporate personhood, the ability of the law to conjure up an artificial person. But what really matters, the set of competencies that empowered this spectre, which allowed it to extend itself in space and time. one could almost say that the fiction of corporate personhood emerged as the basis of long-distance corporations because it conveniently resolved or held together a number of capacities or competencies that were needed to manage transoceanic ventures. I guess what I want to suggest here is that if one looks at the contemporary form of the corporation, which is very different, you can see in it the archaeological traces of this emergence of the modern form of the corporation from the long-distance corporation and the relations to contingencies that it evolved. Maybe we could talk a bit more about that later. So I'm conscious that I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to, Okay. Corporations use contracts of different kinds to structure their operations. Captains of their ships and their agents in the Americas were salaried employees who were often also paid a bonus when an expedition went well. When colonial settlements were formed, the grants of land to settlers were made pursuant to a constitution drawn up in the name of the corporation, and the tenure of each settler was held in almost feudal style. Settlers were not permitted to bargain for land directly with Native Americans or appropriate land in their own name. The corporation was represented on the ground by agents who adapted the constitution to the various contingencies as they arose. Now, this is a vast oversimplification of the diverse kinds of agency that were involved, but it suffices to make the point that these different legal relations were transacted, performed, and controlled in the name of the corporation, so that the corporation was represented across these diverse settings. And it's that notion of representation that is crucial to our understanding of the corporation. And there is in the background of the early corporation a legal mode of representation that was formed in the context of private law, but is best illustrated or exemplified in the administration of the church. In the Catholic Church in the 12th and 13th centuries, agency was adapted to the institutional, political, and theological structure of the church. In assuming the office of Vicarius Christi, and hence a form of power that was legitimated as the representation of a superior authority, Innocent III himself exemplified agency as the representation of an absent principle or dominus. And this logic of acting vicariously operated throughout the hierarchies of the church. Each officer of the church, from bishops downwards, became a vicarius, an agent who did not act in his own name, but whose acts directly bound the person he represented and who acted through him. In other words, the whole structure of the church is based on one person acting as if they were another, person lower down acting as if they were the superior, and that acting as if is sufficiently powerful to bind the person who's being represented and who doesn't actually know what the person lower down is doing. So this mode of representation, in the sense of delegation through substitution, relayed the center to periphery within the organization of the church. So I'm suggesting there is an analogy between this and the form of the long-distance corporation. In the ecclesiastical context, representation involved speaking in the name of another, but not doing so in the manner of a messenger charged with repeating a formula verbatim, but in the mode of a free interpreter. In other words, the words of the representative, formulated, conceived by the representative, substituted for the intention of the person represented. So this is just a snapshot of a very complex legal institution. But my suggestion is that if we're looking at the alien form of agency, excrescence that I referred to earlier, the form of agency that is operative in the extractive relation that we have to the earth, then it's not just the corporation as such, as a fictitious person that we need to think about. It is the elaboration of this abstract grammar of agency, the grammar of agency that is evolved through this logic of representation. And it's through this that one might call a kind of alien, if I can say this word, or this neologism, a capitaloplasm, has evolved and been naturalized. So I could say more, but maybe we could pick up on this in conversation. I guess the point I'm trying to reach is that if we're thinking about the relation between law and land, terraforming invites and opens up thinking about what law does to land. I would like to switch that around a little and think about what kind of agency or agent is it that is being generated or generates itself and then constitutes land in its image. And that alien agency is the one that is formed through a logic of representation that begins with Innocent III and extends into the form of the corporation in the modern world through the long-distance corporation. And then by the time we get to Sörgel and his fantasies of the Mediterranean and the Sahara, you can see a similar kind of management of contingency, a similar governmentality of contingency in operation there, which is also corporatized in a different form of corporation, which is the managerial controlling corporation that we have today. So I'm going to stop there and hope that we have enough on the table for conversation. Thank you.
Can you, yeah, okay. I can hear myself, so you can all hear me. Thank you so much for the lecture and kind of amazing exposition that I think, and I'm sure just judging on how full the lecture hall is, there will be many questions. But I think I might kind of kick off perhaps slightly to where you ended, but also kind of linking it back to where you begun. I'm interested kind of maybe constructing a slightly more methodological lens. When media, under the frame of the legal, does that ever become representational? Or does the kind of legal always involve itself, the material or the real? And why I'm kind of interested in, and I don't mean to construct them as binaries, but representational, the material and the real, how is the imagination is constructed from those kind of three, perhaps enmeshed, interlinked, or process, or actually maybe they're kind of processes that take hold within this kind of agency that you're constructing through the presentation. And why I think this is really interesting is that through the kind of lineage that you bring us, or kind of through the artifacts that you're exposing, I'm interested in the kind of role of the imaginary as it asserts itself as a motivation of, or a kind of artifact of desire, and a kind of artifact that project, right, in the kind of construction and the redefinition of territory. And I think that somehow what could become interesting is how representation, the imaginary and the material, can somehow be interlinked but also be interchangeable within the kind of methodology or this kind of understanding that you bring forward. And I'm kind of interested in how, if law becomes a kind of form, and maybe I'm thinking about this slightly spatially, right? If these kind of architectures or these spaces become kind of material institutions that gather and somehow focus these kind of imaginary dispositions, these projections, what is the role of representation within that interchange?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, or actually set of questions. I mean, I think in terms of the imaginary and representational, I think you can think about, and it's an argument that I would like to make, is that you can think about the corporation as a work of speculative fiction. And so, whereas of course, good speculative fiction is critical and engages critically with existing institutions and forms and modes of racialization and gendering and so on, corporation is obviously not that. In a very similar way, it imaginarily generates or constitutes one's non-human ways of being, or and then sort of ratifies them or naturalizes them in all sorts of different ways. So I think you do have a sort of materialization of the imaginary in that sense, in the form of the corporation. And we don't necessarily see it as a work of speculative fiction, because I think we see the fictional person and we can critique it and we can deconstruct it and we can sort of hold the oil majors, for example, to account for what they're doing. But we're still thinking about them as being kind of fictional people. We're not seeing the sorts of grammars of functions and roles and so on, of which representation I think is the most important one that is going on and is sort of facilitating this work that corporations do. So I think the imaginary aspect is huge, and I didn't, in a sense, talk about it. I didn't talk about, for example, the fact that, this is the Dutch East India Company. They have their own insignia. They have their own coinage. They have their own flags. They have the sense in which, this is not quite the mode representation you mean. It's not even the one I mean in terms of speculative fiction, but it's just interesting that the people who are acting as agents are acting under the description of being agents. You see what I mean? Of the corporation at every moment through these kind of symbolic and other devices, which are of course also media of a certain kind. So I think there are different layers of that representation and imaginary going on.
And I think this kind of connects to my kind of second question, which is, and maybe this is kind of slightly linking back to the kind of agenda, perhaps, of this lecture series, where we're kind of trying to decipher disciplines, or like the way in which kind of methodologies are constructed by various practitioners, such as Alain, in the kind of definition of a discipline. And I'm interested in, so if through the kind of presentation, the role of the artifact, in a way, there's this kind of really interesting, maybe it is a method, this kind of method of trying to expose an archive. This kind of really strong connection that begins to emerge between kind of power, but how it resonates within a kind of artifact, a space, a line, a kind of projection. And I'm wondering, maybe this is a kind of slightly more personal question, how does that happen? How does that kind of methodology of thinking about the relationship between legal form, law, artifact, medium, registration begin to happen as a kind of mode of investigation?
That's an interesting and difficult question, particularly relating to this, because I think these are not necessarily the artifacts I would usually work with. I would usually want to work with something much more precise. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we had a conversation earlier about what I was working on, and I mentioned the logotype and typography. Yeah. So with typography, for example, I mean the artifact of the letter, particularly if you look at it in its sort of the very earliest sort of forms of printed letters, there's a whole scene of the artifact that I want to unfold and do unfold when I'm talking about that. Here it's a bit more complicated, precisely because, going back to your first question, we are talking about this imaginary in different ways. So maybe what I'm looking for, and maybe this is what's represented in the different images I've shown, are artifacts which somehow express or manifest that being. But I'm not convinced that these are perfect ones. Yeah. That's kind of what I like to do, and I think the reference to archive is absolutely.
But then, sorry to interrupt you. But there seems to be this kind of draw to an object. No.
Yes.
This kind of isolation of an object and then kind of understanding it in its kind of reality, which I think is a really interesting way to think about representation somehow, also kind of spatially, that these things become actually projective in form.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot think about law without thinking about material.
Yeah. Why?
Diverse kind. Yeah. Because I just don't believe that it exists out there. Yeah. I don't believe in the pure discursive, notion. I think it's always practiced, materialized, technological in all sorts of ways, even if it's that or, whatever the other images I've shown are. And so I'm always looking for some material vector and medium.
Amazing. I think maybe that's the perfect moment to open it up to the audience. If we have any questions, lovely Harriet has her mic. Oh yeah, over there. Wait, sorry, just wait for the mic.
There's a question over there.
Oh, and there's a question over there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I think today is a funny day as well that this takes place, because today we had a few thousand farmers descend on Westminster to protest an introduction to inheritance tax of agricultural assets worth or valued over 1 million. It's quite a lot. I think it's also quite interesting because it looks, I don't know, I think in this country we see the farmers as this kind of sacred, quite homegrown thing. And we don't see farms and agriculture often as this big business, which is very much what it is, especially after such high values. Would you talk about or expand on how the idea of inheritance or taxation of land in inheritance kind of maybe affects how we feel about territory as something that we belong to or belongs to us?
Where to begin with that? Having just crossed the channel where farmers protest a lot in a very different way, not being led by whatever the French version of Jeremy Clarkson would be. I think that's a very difficult question to unravel. So I'm going to think about a date, which is 1897. And 1897 is the date in which you first have the taxation of inheritance of landed wealth in England. And then from that point on, you begin to have effectively the kind of destruction of the massive landed estates that were the basis for a whole farming economy. It's where you start to see people giving or reaching arrangements with the National Trust for their country piles to sort of somehow keep things going. So there's the moment that connection that you're talking about between taxation and inheritance first gets made. And it's where that particular economy, you're talking about the way in which we think about farmers, certainly a sort of very traditional sense of that economy goes. And obviously there is a connection between that and what I've been talking about in terms of territory, electrification, hydropower, and a very different sort of rationale of, where it is that wealth comes from and how wealth is generated. So I'm not avoiding your question if I say, it's very difficult to pick that apart, because for me that's fascinating, but it's we could talk for a very long time.
I think there's a question over there.
Hello, thank you very much. This was very interesting. And my question kind of like follows up on the other questions that you've been posed already. Because I found it curious, you talked about so many huge notions, terminologies, processes, land, territory, property. And I found it interesting that the human didn't figure in that at all. And I found it so stark, that sort of contrast that you made between the mixing of labor and land, the harvesting as transforming a land into property, and then you talked about the plantation, but you didn't talk about the enslaved laborers who also labor on that land, but then the land doesn't transform into property or into anything that they have any say over. So I was wondering if the figure of the human or the figure of the non-human or infra-humanity figures at all in your theory, and then how that connects to all of these questions of representation, agency, corporations, etc.
Thank you. An excellent question. I think that for me, what I'm trying to get at here is not to sort of strip the world of humans at all. Rather, what I want to think about is the constitution of a world or a planet. These terms are contested, obviously, in terms of Earth, world, planet, globe. We know that. But I can think of the construction of what I call a Euro-American world or planet or globe, to the exclusion of others, predicated on parasitizing, as I've said, the labor of others systematically over time. And I want to think about what made that possible. What is it that perdures into the present, that still you can see in the immortal forms of corporations today. And if you look at many of the world's leading corporations, you see this. You know, Royal Dutch Shell in the news recently, great example. So it's not at all to deny, disavow, or not talk about that. It's more to sort of shift the focus to these agencies and to specify exactly what it is that makes the corporation this systematically extractive, parasitic form that it always has been, what gives it those competencies. And then, you know, we can go back and reflect on and think about, for me, so I'm not, there are other projects I have that would engage with what you're talking about in a different way, but this is just about this alien agency and trying to specify it while being totally cognizant of its effects in the world.
Great. I think John has a question in the front.
Alain, thank you. As always, you are so eloquent. I have a question about the vicarage. And it seems to me that your figure of the alien agent and tied to the possibility of almost of a schizophrenic vicar that is both an individual and another person at the same time is so important, and I wanted to thank you for that. But I have a question in relationship to the possibility of thinking that vicarage is not only one way, that there's multiple mediations, in particular technique mediations in those forms of representation. And I wanted to ask you whether you're thinking that the figure of the vicar is that only the human, also the possibility of an encounter with another vicar, the land, or another vicar, which is maybe the line on a map. So I wanted to maybe push a little bit more about that schizophrenic dimension of mediation and agency, where things never appear for only what they are. And in particular, I wanted to maybe add to that a question about hesitation and how agency could be addressed not only through the straight lines and the retinal dimensions of the representations that we've seen on the screen, but through maybe the moment of encounter with techniques that we don't completely master, and the meandering dimensions of making things, which I think maybe is implicit in the notion of the alien, but maybe I misunderstood that. So it's a question about schizophrenia and technical mediation.
Well, obviously, three fantastic questions or prompts. I think on the question of the vicarius or the vicar, absolutely, certainly not one way. It's as though you have like a kind of chiasmus between representer and represented, in the form that neither is a self. there is no self in this logic. And I think if you look at the way that all systems operate, that is the hidden truth actually of all legal subjects, and that's why for me they are medial in character, because there's they're always being subverted, supplanted, but neither is themselves. So that's what Locke cannot see, but what in a sense you begin to see through Michel Serres and the parasite, for example, is that logic. So I absolutely agree with that. The idea of encountering the line or the presence of other practices, I think absolutely. And I think maybe I could back up a little and say there's a danger in the way that I have presented things today in missing out on one dimension, which is that it suggests sort of overly linear representation and overly instrumental modes of representation. So I'm still talking about parasitizing and exploiting contingency, but there is obviously contingency in those practices themselves, or in those practices of representation. And there are so many encounters with things going on from the boat, for example, of course, is crucial. The form of letters or letter writing, which is also crucial in this scene, particularly for the Jesuits. If I had time, I would have wanted to address those. But I need to think more about the line, actually. It's a very provocative prompt. So I want to think a bit more about that question. Thank you.
Any other questions? There's a question.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. I'm curious about the corporation and if it's a form of detachment from moral behaviors, perhaps, from the state. Because if, say, going to the Americas and extracting lots from the land and basically stealing it from people is something that was done in the name of one individual, say, someone who wasn't even in the monarchy, you could see it as something which couldn't be detached from someone's personhood. But once you have companies and corporations, the liability is so dispersed that you can't really point to one person, be it in centuries past or even to this day, say in oil companies or other companies and corporations that extract from places. So I'm curious if you think that this is something that was useful in centuries past and was a form of being able to kind of do certain things that perhaps people wouldn't be able to do solely as individuals, if the corporation is a method of legitimizing pursuits that would be hard to do if it was based off of an individual's acts themselves.
It's an interesting question in the sense that if you think about, John Locke, who worked and was a landgrave for the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, so was part of the colonial venture. He worked on equipping the ships that were sent out. He, as I say, owned slaves through the corporation that he was part of. At the same time, he was, of course, this supposedly tremendously important figure in liberal, moral reflection. So I think kind of what that tells us is that it's one way of saying there's a complete externalization of any morality of that kind in that period, as to what's going on because even before you have the conquest of the Americas, you have the Royal Africa Company, which is basically engaging in slavery off the west coast of Africa. I just don't think there was a sense of morality that had to be avoided, if you see what I mean. All there was profit to be made, and liability that existed was purely economic in terms of liability for the capital that had been invested. So if you fast forward to the modern epoch, But of course, it's a big debate in sort of climate change area about the responsibility of corporations. How do you hold them accountable? It's a little bit ironic going to Royal Dutch Shell, for example, which has been in the news this week because of the case in the Netherlands, that it made itself vulnerable to the kinds of claims that are being made now because it reorganized in the early 1990s its corporate structure in response to a number of scandals involving the Amoco Cadiz oil spill Africa, off the northwest coast of France, its support for the military repression of the Ogoni people in Nigeria, and a whole other set of other things that Shell was engaged with. At a certain point, it said in the 90s, well, this is because we don't have control over our subsidiaries. It's brought them in and created an organigram in which it was in control of everything, which all of a sudden put responsibility for the head office back on the agenda. So there's a whole game corporations that they play in terms of responsibility or responsibilization, whether legal or otherwise. But I have yet to encounter, in looking at the colonial discourses in the late 17th and early 18th century, any sense that there's a morality that is problematic in terms of what they're doing, even for supposedly religious characters like Locke. But it's that question of responsibility is fundamental, and is coming back more and more insistently with the climate change question.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one from the audience. Up front.
I've not formulated it very well, but I just thought it seems like whenever we imagine or communicate, it's very hard to sort of like maybe not over-represent, especially if you want to present it in a linear way, which is maybe where things get heard. If you start to present a non-linear narrative and it goes everywhere, it sort of never really maybe gets into people's mind. I was wondering if the law itself provide any, or the lens of laws provide any ways of sort of working with a more equitable imaginary, just because I'm also thinking partly law also builds on the kind of majority kind of people in the middle. So I'm thinking, is there any way we could, that could be done better, like imaginations and representation.
Could you just flesh out a little bit the equitable imaginary notion?
I think that it's a very hard notion. I think I've heard the otherwise in maybe what you've presented, which is beautifully put together. And I think the problem I'm struggling with is maybe this whole thing around equitability in some ways, where I think almost like every angle that I've seen or tried or like heard people trying always have a bit of thing in it that just doesn't sit well. It's like, oh yeah, but if you do that, that could also be excluding. It's almost like by defining something, you naturally exclude something. And so I'm thinking, what is the right thing to do? Like, what other options do we have? Because it's almost like the moment we speak, it's like, yeah, we've just excluded that other bit. So there's that part where I'm thinking, what are your thoughts on these things?
Well, I think first of all, you're absolutely right that any presentation, any way of organizing things is necessarily going to exclude. You're distinguishing, drawing a partage between one way of presenting things and another. How do you hold more stuff together? How do you compose? How do you try and be, in Haraway's terms, sympoietic about the way in which you present? I think it would be a sort of challenge, not just of thinking but writing and communicating in the very rich sense that you're imagining it. I certainly don't think law has any resources to offer, partly because of the incipiently adversarial and programmatic nature of law as a discipline. in the sense that you're always hunting down responsibility somewhere, which tends to, the responsibility you're hunting down may be one that goes towards being equitable in a broader sense, but it's not equitable. It's not an equitable imaginary. So I hear the question, and I see what it might look like, but I'm not sure I can I can propose the sort of practices that would be necessary to get there.